Welcome back. Today we are going to go over LETSHUOER's Cadenza 4. I guess you can see it over there too. So we're going to go through this first bit a bit quicker because we got a lot of things to cover, but this is very similar to, if you're familiar with the S15, you've got the metal faceplate with the nice design with the little ridges on it. The bottom is, I think, 3D printed plastic, and it's got 3 bores there. The side says Cadenza 4, True Virtuoso. So that's kind of what's going on in the shell. It's actually comfortable. It's not, nozzle isn't too big. Nice comfortable fit for me. The cable, I talked about the cable in a totally different video. This cable versus LETSHUOER's upgraded Nebula cable. Do check that out. Not going to go over all the things that are in the box. There's lots of nice accessories in the box, but we've got other things to take care of and go over. Same thing on the graph. This one graphs very similar to their own EJ07M. It actually graphs very similar to lots of other hybrids, and they all end up kind of looking like this. It's kind of a variation on the base shelf. Then you end up with a lowered pinna. So for those of you who are into Harman style 10 dB pinna, these sets all tend to be about 7. I think this one's at 6 or 7, and then they go out through extension. But when you try to graph it against lots of other sets, it ends up being very similar to lots of sets, and the devil is actually in the details, not so much the levels that they pick, because the levels all sound well on lots of sets, so that's why they choose it. What is important that was just announced today is the Cadenza 4 is going to be $249. It is going to be $229 during the pre-sale period, which is March 25th through the 31st, and that's in a few days from now. So do take note, if you were interested in getting it, you'll get a little small discount on it for pre-ordering it. So let's kind of jump into it, because there is lots of words on the page and lots of things to cover. So who would I think is kind of best at buying something like this, or who should look at $200 sets in general? And I think I kind of classify people into 2 different categories. The instant upgraders, people who are new to the hobby. Perhaps they buy their first KZ set, they get it, they're blown away by how much value and sound quality you can get for $30 or maybe even $50. And then they instantly start upgrading and buying new sets, right? They bought it on Monday, got it, and then by Wednesday they're already looking at the next set to buy and ordering on AliExpress. Those people should probably not be ordering $200 sets, because they haven't quite figured out what their preferences are, what they don't like about a certain set, what they're looking for in their next set. They're just sort of buying, trying to find their way through and develop these things. And then you get the people who have been in the hobby for quite a bit and who have been listening to their sets for a few months, and those tend to be the people who outgrow it. Those people who have bought their budget sets and have figured out that maybe the dynamic driver doesn't hit the sound quality they're looking for, or they're looking for more treble, more detail, more technical details, bigger soundstage. They can identify certain characteristics that they are looking for in their next set. And that's sort of where the $200 range and in these kind of sets fill that gap. These sets offer characteristics that are improved, but not, I wouldn't say that everything in the $200 range is a guaranteed upgrade over everything that you find in the budget. This one covers certain characteristics, which we will talk about, and then other sets offer certain other characteristics. But the $200 range, you tend to need to narrow down what you are looking for into specifics, as opposed to saying, I have this $30 or $40 set, I am looking for something in the $200 range because I have $200, but I don't really know what I'm looking for. I'm just looking for something better. Looking for something better tends to end up in regret, so don't do that. So what is it? And like we talked about, this one is a 10mm beryllium coated dynamic driver. So it's a 1+3, so 1 dynamic driver, 3 balanced armatures. One of them happens to be a Sonian, 2 of them happen to be Knowles balanced armatures. So that's what's inside the plastic shell. Those of you who are following kind of the latest trend on hybrids, I had tried one that was the CKLVX 1+4 recently. I'll say kind of generally that one sounds very two-dimensional and very small compared to Cadenza 4. CKLVX didn't scale at all for me. So first, volume-wise, you tend to turn up the volume a little bit. You get a little bit more detail, maybe a little bit bigger soundstage. That one just sounds more unbalanced. So that didn't really scale in that way. And you plug it into a different amplifier, something of a higher quality amplifier, expecting it to sound a little bit better. And that one just tends to sound the same because the stage is small, everything is overlapping on top of each other. It's kind of a Didn't really have enough space to actually hear any improvement over amplifier. So it's kind of where I would say that one kind of fell short. It kind of sounds okay until you start comparing it to something else. So sound on the Cadenza 4, I would say it's borderline play anything. It's got enough bass and enough treble to cover the popular genres, but also enough control and technical capability to cover some of the more technical genres, jazz or classical. I think they actually hit both on this, and you can also lean it into either way. If you're more into pop music, you can EQ. If you're more into more technical genres, you can actually just leave it the way it is, and it's probably fine. But what actually was a little bit different for Cadenza for me was I had this urge to listen to tracks that I haven't listened to in a while, or I heard a track that I heard on TV. In this case, I was watching Triple Frontier on Netflix. The credit scene to that is actually Metallica's Orion. And about halfway through the song, I just had the urge to go listen to it on Cadenza 4. And it doesn't happen on every set. I mean, some sets I kind of dread going back and listening to just to take notes and then talk about them in a review. And then there's sets like this where I would just rather listen to it and hear different tracks and hear how Metallica plays on Cadenza 4 because it's really, really good. And that's what this set was. And that's why I sort of really, really liked Cadenza 4 in that way. Not every set catches my attention. Not every set pulls me in to go listen to this. I heard this track in the car. I heard this track on TV. Now I want to hear it on Cadenza 4. That doesn't happen all that often. It does on Cadenza 4. So yeah, as far as a set that I really, really like, this one sort of hit that. And I like hybrids. This one sort of caught my attention. And I like EJ07M. And I like other things that LETSHUOER has done. So it's not all that surprising. I think they did pretty nice execution on this one. So yeah, not all that surprised that I had a real fondness for this set. So what else do we know about the sound? So it does have a controlled dynamic driver and bass shelf. So the marketing on this one said they used this beryllium coated dynamic driver is from one of their more expensive sets. I have no idea which set or what that means, but what it means to me is this controlled bass shelf, and you don't have a dynamic driver that was kind of bloated, really overstepping into the mids. It really stayed low in the stage, keeping the mids and the upper treble air clean. No boost means there's no masking, and it really kept control, right? A little bit too much mid bass, a little bit too much sub bass would have masked over what happens in the mids, which we will talk about in a bit, and that wouldn't have been good. So this style of tuning is very much about control, keeping the bass a little bit under, keeping the treble a little bit under, and that keeps your mids a little bit more forward, a little bit cleaner, and you can hear everything end to end. So the mids, relaxed pinna, very much a mid-focus, kind of an EJ vibe is what I would say. And it's really how the mids and the treble are handled, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But having the bass and the treble just a kind of a half step below the mids, keeping them forward and, as a focus is something that EJ did as well. So that's why I said I wouldn't call it a mini EJ, but I would say it has a lot of that vibe. Treble, keep the levels mostly linear and extend into natural airiness, exactly what it does. No peaky bright spots and no splashy over energetic spots, things that you don't want to hear in a hybrid. And also deliver a 3D stage and imaging is what it really does. So did it avoid the $200, $300 curse? And I would say it did. I think there's lots of sets in the $200 range which are full of problems and they don't really resemble sets that are more expensive. And I think Cadenza 4 did a great job at representing characteristics that you would find in more expensive sets and executing them quite well with a nice set of drivers. So yeah, I do think that this one does represent those characteristics that you'd find more expensive sets, the things that I just talked about, things like control and balance and extension and the whole experience. I think Cadenza 4 really delivered on those. So is it a $200 king? And I'll be the first to say there aren't really any $200 kings. There are $200 sets that have fewer problems, but as I talked about in the beginning, you're really looking for sets that hit your preferences. And hitting those preferences with fewer problems leads you to sets that sound good in the $200 range. But as far as a single $200 set that is, head and shoulders above the other ones, there isn't one. There probably never will be one because they always come down to preferences and how they deliver problems and fix faults and deliver nice tuning that matches your preference. That is really hard to do in a general case at $200. So I would say no kings, but this one is actually done pretty well. And as I said, LeTSHUOER really stacked the deck on this one with a set of nice drivers and nice tuning. So it's definitely a step in that direction. So is it as perfect as I just described? And can it be improved? Now, so you can improve it a little bit, just tick the bass 1 to 2 dB. And I think David Bowie's voice on China Girl, if you're familiar with that song, he's got kind of a deeper bit to his voice. You can really put the depth and body back into it if you'd use a little EQ. And I would say do it, especially I don't have a whole lot of warm sources, so mine are more neutral. So I definitely enjoyed Cadenza 4 with a little bit EQ. And don't underestimate how much that adds to the overall range and experience that you get on this set. I think it's kind of a huge improvement if you do it. And you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. So Cadenza 4 is sort of down here at the bottom. It's probably only 1 or 2 dB away from where CKLVX is, and maybe 2 away from where the resin was. But if you just close the gap with 1 dB, I think that kind of gets you right in the ballpark of exactly where it should be to handle genres that need a little bit more mid-bass without clouding up the stage with too much sub-bass and just adding in overall depth and body to the lower ranges. And I think that pretty much gets rid of all the leanness that I will mention eventually. So the bass, again, tuned to complement and not overstep the mids or the treble. Lots of sub-bass extension over level, and you have to wrap your head around what that really means. You don't find that too often. Again, this is one of these things that you have to outgrow. Lots of sets in the kind of more affordable sub $100 range tend to just crank up the sub-bass, so people review it and say, oh, there's lots of rumble and it sounds really nice. You get lots of extension because there's lots of rumble. That's not exactly the way higher end sets operate, and this one in particular does extension without increasing the level to the point where it clouds the stage or it overrides air, sort of something that CKLVX did in a bad way. So this is more about providing extension and hearing that rumble all the way out there without it overstepping into the mids or affecting anything else in a negative way. So yeah, you don't hear it all that often in cheaper sets, but when you hear it in a more expensive set, to hear that extension extend without it really affecting anything in a negative way is actually quite different. And again, one of the things that you need to outgrow or grow into. Mid-bass definitely has a cleaner, leaner snap to it, not losing definition or texture because of the sub-bass is actually in check. All those are actually very good things. Again, people talk about bass textures and what that really means, and it's really hard to do bass texture when you have bass that's slightly overstepping or bloated or kind of booming out in a way that just kind of masks over any texture that you would be hearing. So you need kind of a bass shelf like this that extends all the way through sub-bass but doesn't give you so much of a level that you are missing the texture, and that's what this driver in particular in this tuning actually does quite well. So this is another berry coated dynamic driver tuned to pair with a balanced armature, not balanced armatures tuned to a dynamic driver. Again, so they kept it a little bit leaner, and you look at why they kept this level the way it is and dropped this down a little bit. It's basically to pair with the 2 balanced armatures. So this still sounds a little bit more technical, a little bit leaner, a little bit cleaner, and that matches well with everything else. The other alternative to that is to really kind of making this warmer and then making the balanced armatures warmer so they match this, and that's not what they did. This is more about the dynamic driver sound and the bass, leaving a more technical style bass that actually matches with the balanced armatures that you're going to hear about a little bit later. So I think they did a pretty good job on that. And again, if this one sounds a little bit too clean for you, you have a very neutral source. You need a little more growl in your male vocals, just tiny EQ, 1 or 2 dB there, kind of gets you there. So on the mids, so I wrote top and variations, and I think for hybrids, you tend to see people looking for 2 different things. So Zen's top will be the warmer, smoother version of a hybrid, more of a hybrid sounding like a dynamic driver, and I think lots and lots of people love that style sound. And then you get variations, which is at the opposite end, which is the more technical style hybrid. So really emphasis on treble and details and micro details and delivering an upper range that kind of stands out way above what you would get in a dynamic driver. And Cadenza 4 sort of splits the difference. It's not quite the warm and smooth that you get on top. It's not treble heavy and detailed beast like Variations. It kind of sits in between the two. And I think sitting in between the two is going to work for some people. People who are looking for either end of it, it's not going to work for you. But people who are looking for the middle of a compromise between having something that still has technical capability but not overly analytical is sort of where Cadenza finds the sweet spot. I'll also say there's a mids bias to it. Again, I talked about this. I think about it as the mids on a plateau, and then the bass is a half step kind of back here, and the treble is a half step back there. So your mids tend to be a little bit more forward because the bass and the treble are a half step back. And that's quite different than adding a lot of boost to get the mids even more forward. So this is sort of an unforced way to bring your mids forward to avoid the recession that you get on V-shaped sets. This is almost the inversed V. So you bring the bass down, bring the treble down, and your mids tend to float a little bit more forward. So I would call it forward, but lower ear gain. Like I said, it's only 6 or 7. You get energy, but not over energetic. The bass carries over kind of minimal warmth, and it isn't really warmed over in the mids trying to overcome BA timbre, like I said. Kind of the way Zen's Top did that really well, the way Variation sort of did it in an analytical way, so you sort of lean into what balanced armatures do well. Cadenza is kind of right in the middle of those two. Kind of closer to, what I would say is closer to the opposite of kind of where Variations was. You try to reveal as much as you can out of the 3 drivers without pushing anything. And you have to understand that it's only 3 balanced armatures. They're going to have limitations on resolution and detail. And the lower is a bit leaner to bring that out. The upper isn't over energetic to hide it. And you really try to bring the mids just slightly forward to reveal more without forcing more detail. And sometimes you bump the ear gain, and that gives you a little bit more apparent detail. Sometimes you bump the 5K, that gives you a little bit more apparent detail. This is the opposite. This is sort of bringing back the treble a half step back, bringing the bass a half step back, and revealing what's in the mids. Kind of a different style than what you're typically going to be used to, or especially if you are into V-shaped sets. This is almost the opposite of that. So the intention here is to do coherence and naturalness, which is what you want to hear in a hybrid, or what you may want to hear. That's what I want to hear in a hybrid. But it definitely reveals from the mids rather than the treble. If you're into variation style sets that do a lot of detail and micro detail and emphasis on the treble, this is not that style. This one reveals from the mids, like I said. You get, and as I just talked about, so you control both ends to deliver the middle rather than a treble blast is sort of what you get on Variations. So as I said, this one is very much engagement from the middle section. Vocal-led tracks, maybe like Carrie Underwood's Blown Away, Miley Cyrus' Wrecking Ball. And again, these are tracks that I wouldn't say are test tracks. These are tracks that I kind of ran across somewhere else. Like I think I actually heard Carrie Underwood's Blown Away on TV, and I just wanted to hear it on Cadenza 4. And again, you just get this midsection that leads, and she needs to lead. Her voice needs to lead that track, and everything else, it just can't be lost or buried behind. And really executed hybrids do that really well. And this is one of those occasions where you just hear her voice and it sounds dimensional, and there's nice contrast to it because what's behind her voice is the black background, because there's no bass burying the background or blurring the mids. Everything works together to do really nice style mids, but it's not in a typical way that you're used to. They didn't force her voice so far forward that is really in your face. It's the opposite. It's bringing back the bass, bringing back the treble, so she is out in front, but nothing is lost in the background because everything is so clean and well done and controlled that, everything just works together in that way. And again, slightly different. It takes a while to appreciate what is going on in Cadenza 4, but when you hear that contrast and dimension to the mids, you sort of know that there's something special here. And very much what I appreciated about this set is sort of And Molly Cyrus, again, that's one of these tracks where her voice sounds very two-dimensional on that set. And when you hear it done on a set, that actually adds some dimension to her voice, and there's body to her voice, and it doesn't sound like it's so edgy. Yeah, really, really nice rendition of that track. And again, not a test track. I have pretty bad taste in music, but that's kind of a pretty good example of it there. So treble, again, some graphs will show this one a little bit brighter than what it is, and it's actually not all that bright. It's very even sounding, it's very linear, there's no bright spots. If you are going to ding the timbre, somewhere in the treble, you definitely hear that slight metallicness of a balanced armature step out. And I'll admit, they did a pretty good job of hiding it without really rolling off the treble, without hiding it somewhere in the upper treble. I think they did a pretty good job at that. And also, if you look closely at the graph, it will also say that it definitely needs more volume. And it's a little bit harder to see it if you just look at the graph. But this little bit, the way that kind of rolls off in that way, it definitely can appreciate a turn to the right of the volume knob. And once you hear, like I talked about Max Richter's Four Seasons, as you're listening to those tracks play out, and if you play with the volume, you sort of notice at what point different instruments and different players pop in and pop out, which ones sort of fall behind and are a little bit harder to hear, so you took the volume up. So I wouldn't say it's a high volume set at all. It definitely scales really well with volume, but you got to play with it a bit just so, and I would say that EJ07M wasn't exactly in the same position. Lower volume listeners aren't going to hear enough of the upper treble, and you just have to tick it up one or two, and then it kind of falls in place. But I wouldn't say it's a high volume set at all. It just can appreciate and sound a little bit more engaging at higher volume, I think is what I actually said about it. So yeah, so it definitely gets more engaging at slightly more volume. And stage, again, noticeable right out of the box. Balance on this one leads to a three-dimensionality of this one. The stage is actually really nice in all three dimensions. And if you EQ the bass a little bit, add a little bit more to the range on the lower end, you definitely get some more depth to the stage and dimension to the stage. And this is also where you're going to notice amp scaling. And again, this is kind of one of these weird things where I was playing with it on 3 or 4 different amps, and some of them on the depth sounds a little bit flatter, some of them sounds more deeper, and it was very much apparent how this one scales on different amps as opposed to CKLVX, which basically sounded the same. It always sounded flat and small, but this one can very much appreciate a nicer amplifier. And again, sort of goes back to my initial point of who should look at sets like this. People who have been in the hobby a bit, may have nicer gear, may have nicer dongles, but can really appreciate some of these smaller things that are brought out on a nicer source device, on a set that has nicer drivers and nicer tuning, and it's going to reveal those parts in the midsection as we talked about. So that is what I got on Cadenza 4. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.